A game so bad it led to divorce? So much for the nuclear family, here on NES Works episode 166.
This is a professional matter! Yeah!
Dig Dug, one of the all-time greats. I drop a quarter into it every time I see a machine. It's a classic. And this is not that Dig Dug. Here we see once again the knock-on effects of the unfortunate friction that existed between Nintendo and Namco in the NES era. You'll recall that Namco's early Famicom titles did plenty of heavy lifting for the console in its freshman days. And their spot-on conversions of arcade hits like Pac-Man and, yes, Xevious gave Nintendo the leg up it really needed against competing consoles like SG-1000 and Super Cassette Vision. When Nintendo realized it needed to tighten up the wild, out-of-control world of third-party publishers on Famicom, Namco said, "You wouldn't have gotten here without us," and elected not to publish its hits on NES. Other publishers like Sunsoft and Bandai stepped in, yes, but Namco didn't publish their own work on NES until 1993. That means we received a patchwork selection of Namco classics, and some of the company's best early titles never reached NES. But we did see sequels to those games, the thinking, I suppose, being that no one would want a conversion of a 1982 game like Mappy or Dig Dug, but that their sequels would be fresher and newer and more appealing to the kids. However, the Nintendo-Namco split is not the divorce I referred to earlier. No, I am talking about Dig Dug, or rather, its protagonist, Taizo Hori. As any smart and cool person knows, the Dig Dug universe has a shockingly enormous amount of lore attached to it. Among the nuggets of narrative that Namco has nourished our nerdy souls with is the fact that the hero of Dig Dug, Taizo, went on to marry the heroine of Baraduk, Kissy. They had kids together and everything. But then they split, and these days Taizo is a slightly broken man after the breakup. I realize that this is an unkind thing to say about a video game, but Dig Dug 2 may go a long way toward explaining why things didn't work out for Taizo and Kissy. In the end, everyone wants to respect their life partner, and it's a little tough to respect someone who shows up in a game like this. Dig Dug 2 isn't terrible, but it's a far cry from the elegant perfection of the original game. It abandons the side view and maze creation action of Dig Dug in favor of something flashier, but less intuitive. The original Dig Dug took the Pac-Man concept of avoiding monsters in a maze and turned it into a game in which players created their own maze and effectively hunted foes. Taizo was still at a disadvantage. His air pump cannon could only destroy a single monster at a time and took a couple of seconds to effect a kill, and he could only move around by digging through earth. Monsters, on the other hand, had the luxury of being able to pass through solid ground when needed and could move more quickly in cleared spaces than Taizo could shoulder aside soil. It's a great game, and Namco's port to Famicom was pretty close to perfect. Dig Dug 2 tilts the perspective to an overhead view, so that Taizo only moves around on the surface rather than underground. There's still an element of clearing away earth here, but it takes a far more chaotic and destructive form. Rather than tunneling narrow mazes, you instead wander around with a big ol' hammer, creating splits in the land that cause chunks of ground to plunge into the ocean. Dig Dug 2 takes place on a series of islands, and you can destroy enemies either by pump-actioning them, as in the original, or by sinking them by dropping the landmasses beneath into the sea. Drowning rather than bursting foes earns you more points. The more enemies you wipe out in a single shot, the more points you earn, so it behooves you to drop a massive chunk of land whenever possible. Sound familiar? Yes, Dig Dug 2 leaves the distinct impression that Namco saw Quicks and said, "Ooh, we want to do that too." For some reason, they decided that Dig Dug should be the vehicle for their Quicks clone. I don't know why either, but this is from the same era that gave us Hopping Mappy. Look, they can't all be Mappy Land. And Dig Dug 2 doesn't have the worst premise I've ever seen. It's just a weird creative choice to center this on a property that had such a wildly different core in its first go-round. Really, I just have two big complaints about Dig Dug 2. First, the controls are strangely imprecise. When Taizo turns and moves, he doesn't do it as crisply as in the original game. Rather than pivoting on the spot, he sort of revolves instead around a central point. This makes it really difficult to line up enemies for a kill shot, because you have to land his pump spear dead center in order to land a hit. In general, Taizo wants to snap to predefined tracks of movement on the land, which makes the action less precise than I feel like it ought to be. And since you can only crack the land by aligning yourself with preset stakes in the ground, more time in Dig Dug 2 is spent arguing with the controls than really ought to be the case. Speaking of imprecise, I'm not a big fan of how the island sinking mechanic works. You can only break the ground along cardinal directions, and only on seams that are pre-baked into each stage. Taizo carries a hammer for the purpose of smashing up the ground, and you create a crack by finding a half-buried stake and pounding it from the side opposite that in which you want to create a crack. When one piece of ground is completely divided from the rest by these breaks, it'll sink into the water. Unfortunately, it's tough to predict in the heat of action which piece of land will sink. Sure, when you crack a tiny panel free, you can be certain that the much larger mass will remain. But when you're creating seams that result in two masses that appear roughly identical in size, you can't be sure precisely which one will fall into the water. Taizo will flounder for a second when he stands at the edge of a landmass that breaks into the water, but you can recover from this pretty easily. More disastrous is when you break a chunk of land expecting the opposite side to plunge, but suddenly realize that your own seemingly safe footing is about to vanish. Worse, attempting to corral an army of monsters into a space so that you can drop them all for a big bonus, only for the rest of the island to plunge instead, leaving you stranded in a very small spot with a host of angry critters, is pretty much a game over scenario. I don't really know how to mitigate this except through memorization of which parts of each stage want to sink and which are rooted to the bedrock. That, combined with the fact that ground break opportunities are preset by the fixed layouts of stakes, makes this feel like a much less dynamic, yet also less manageable game than the original. The designers did attempt to add some variety here by giving monsters the ability to move across cracks by becoming ghosts, like when they floated through the soil, but it still feels like a more limited and less surprising game. Namco did eventually salvage the Dig Dug 2 concept with a DS crossover title called Digging Strike, which combines elements of the original Dig Dug 2, and Mr. Driller into one. It's pretty fantastic, and it relegates the island breaking of Dig Dug 2 to a supporting function, rather than centering it as the core of the action. Sadly, it arrived too late to save Taizo and Kissy's marriage, but you know, maybe that just wasn't meant to be. Man, I had a great little narrative constructed in my head for this next game. It was going to be a real corker of an episode. But then I read up on Championship Bowling and realized all of my assumptions were wrong. Championship Bowling, as you may have sussed from the title, is another game about bowling. There have been a lot of these on this channel to date, and all of the good ones have a single thing in common. They were produced by a company called Athena. World Bowling for Game Boy? Athena. Virtual Bowling for Virtual Boy? Athena. Pocket Bowling for Game Boy Color? Athena. Nestor's Funky Bowling? Not Athena. See how that works? Well, Championship Bowling for NES is pretty damn good. It's bare bones, yes, but it plays really well. And sure enough, the Japanese version was published by, you guessed it, Athena. So that's cut and dried, right? But no, this narrative unfolds in a different direction than you might think. Athena merely published Championship Bowling. They were not, to my knowledge, involved in its actual creation. You can't even point to the fact that publishers often have some creative input into a game, guiding developers to create their preferred product in order to appeal to the masses. That's because Championship Bowling happened in the reverse order of most NES games. Despite being developed in Japan, it shipped in the US first. We have seen that a few times on NES, like Karate Champ, for example. It debuted on NES in 1986 and didn't hit disk system for another 2 years. This didn't happen often, but it did happen. And in this case, Championship Bowling arrived on NES several months before Athena produced its very first bowling game, March 1990's World Bowling for Game Boy. And Athena didn't publish Championship Bowling in Japan until 1991. If you recall the Shadowgate episode and my reconstructed sequence of events that led Kemco to localize the MacVenture series to Famicom, you might think something similar happened here. Namely, that Athena saw good results from World Bowling, said, "We should make ourselves a Famicom adaptation of this," then stumbled across Championship Bowling at CES or something, which caused them to shout, "Eureka! We don't have to make a game, we can just localize this one." Or maybe not. I think it's probably more likely that the linking factor here isn't Athena, but rather Romstar. You know, Romstar. The cool dudes who brought Twin Eagle into our lives. Romstar got its start in arcades, distributing machines by fledgling Japanese companies like Capcom for the US. In 1989, they decided to get into doing the same thing for NES. Around the time that they published Twin Eagle for NES, they also distributed an arcade game called Championship Bowling. I'm not able to find any information on the developer responsible for the arcade game, but based on the art style, mainly the specific kind of lumpiness inherent in the player sprite design, and the languid anime bunny girl who drapes herself over the sign indicating the current frame of play, I'm guessing it was some anonymous put upon Japanese studio. Romstar published both Championship Bowling for NES and Game Boy's World Bowling, clearly an adaptation of Championship Bowling despite the name, soon after. They tapped Athena for the Game Boy development work, and that appears to have set that studio down the path of becoming the best bowling guys on Earth. Athena picked up the NES port of Championship Bowling for Japanese release, then went on to produce quite a few excellent interpretations of the sport in the years to come, as you well know. But who, you might ask, handled the conversion to NES? Well, funnily enough, that was Another, the same folks behind the Black Bass. Believe it or not. Yes, everything is coming together here on NES Works. Another is not a particularly well-loved studio, because they did not do particularly good work most of the time. But I do have to hand it to them. Championship Bowling is great. Better than the arcade game, in my opinion. The arcade version of Championship Bowling has a minimal, no-frills quality about it that seems fitting for a game that was mostly going to be played by men at bars and bowling alleys. It's uncomplicated because it needed to be intuitive for someone who was about 3 beers in. The NES game isn't exactly the bowling equivalent of Baseball Stars, mind you. There's no career simulation here, no character customization, merely a chance to pick up a 10-frame set and aim for the high score. But Another did a great job with the fundamentals. You can play as one of 4 different avatars, each of a different race or gender, and potentially having either a left or right as their dominant hand. You can select a ball of a different weight from 7 pounds to 15. All of these things factor into play. The lighter the ball, the faster you can roll it. Heavier balls roll more slowly, even with a brawny dude as your avatar, but that gives you more opportunity to put some spin on the ball and hit the pins precisely. Rolling involves a 3-step process in which you position your bowler, set your control over the ball, essentially its direction and spin, and define its power, or the speed and force of your roll. This is pretty much the golf swing meter system adapted for 10 pins, and it works brilliantly. The weight, control spin, and speed of your ball give you a ton of control over how you roll. You can roll a forceful straight, or set up the ball to swerve at the last second to clear away a split. But the meters also oscillate at a very rapid rate, which means you need to pay close attention to your inputs to hit the optimal points on the meter. This keeps you involved in the game and prevents play from becoming too mechanical or rhythmic. There's a lot of granularity and a touch of unpredictability to the controls, so every frame plays out a little differently until you get really good at the game. And the physics are, well, not realistic precisely, but satisfying. Certainly very thoughtful in their execution. So there's a lot of fine control for you to play around with. I tend to like golf and bowling video games more than I do team sports, I guess because I'm an antisocial jerk, and Championship Bowling is a great example of the format for the hardware. And it makes sense for Another to have handled this. It fits perfectly into the same uncle games category as the Black Bass. Another did a great job with it, and you can understand why Athena looked at this interpretation of the sport and said, right, this is going to become our personality from now on. Truly the finest in parasocial game development. Next time on NES Works, the real California games.